Hey everybody, you got Shravan Balaji here.
Hey, and you have Christian Madhavan.
Hey, okay, so we are here with our second episode of Brown Bernie Bros present uh, American presidential elections in the era of neoliberalism. We start out with 1968 in our previous episode.
Give it a listen if you haven't.
Absolutely excellent, if we do say so ourselves. And now we're moving on to 1972. So without further ado, let's get into the election. So Krishna, do you want to start by talking about what 1972 entering that election, what the political landscape looked like, and I guess we can then go and touch upon the first term of Richard Nixon.
Yeah, absolutely. Go. Yeah, so I think Nixon, coming out of his victory against Humphrey and Wallace in '68, is accomplishing, actually, and accomplishing being kind of a value neutral term here, quite a lot. I think the big one to talk about is Vietnam, which was sort of the fundamental issue in '68. And what Nixon does, despite claims of being a peace candidate, he starts pulling off something that's called Vietnamization, which is effectively the slow withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam, and basically a handing over, more or less, of the conflict to the South Vietnamese government. Just to give you a sense of numbers here, in 1968, there were 500,000 U.S. troops on the ground in Vietnam. By the time 1972 rolls around, that number's down to 133,000. He's also launching massive bombing campaigns against the North Vietnamese government and people, but is slowly attempting to theoretically ramp down the war. The other big political development I would talk about here was is the passage of the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, and brought basically 25 million new potential voters onto the voter rolls. So kind of everything you've heard in the last 4, 5, 6, whatever elections about the youth vote and rocking the youth vote and all that sort of crap. This all actually kind of stems from this election, where you did for the first time have a significant chunk of the population voting that had never had the chance to do so before.
And there's one thing I want to quickly jump in and add is that there's this huge kind of discrepancy between the activist youth in America at the time and basically everyone else. Just a couple weeks ago, we had the 50th anniversary of the Kent State Massacre, where a bunch of students protesting the Nixon administration's bombing of Cambodia were actually shot at by the Ohio National Guard at Kent State University in Ohio. So you had this very militant activist kind of younger voter wing of the Democratic Party. They were by and large all Democrats or had associations with other leftist organizations. But it is important to note that there are also a lot of just kind of Americans here who didn't go to college, who aren't necessarily involved in super activist circles, who are also part of this potential new youth vote that comes out in force in the 1972 election.
Yes, I think that's a really, really good way of putting it. And then I think the last thing that I'll say around Nixon, and the sort of lead up to '72, is that I think 72 the economy is actually doing quite well. Inflation is up, and there's unemployment, etc. But in general, because Nixon kind of took the country off the gold standard, they were able to engage in sort of economic, let's say, juicing or engineering, that basically led to 100 billion in deficit spending, but put the economy in a really strong place and sort of tamed fears after there had been a recession in '69. So just to kind of provide the overall backdrop here, economy is doing well. In theory, it looks like Vietnam is winding down and being turned over to the Vietnamese. And generally speaking, Nixon is a strong incumbent as we go into '72, and that's something that I think people should not lose track of here.
Well, let's not also forget about how Nixon was doing things in Cold War diplomacy that really no other person, no other president had been able to do it up until this time. After the Sino-Soviet split in 1969, Nixon starts making inroads with the Chinese government. They actually use this thing that's been going on since the mid 60s, which is called ping pong diplomacy to get American table tennis players into China and to have them play table tennis against each other. And Nixon, again, we talked about this in the last episode. Richard Nixon is the only person who can do this because no one would ever doubt him for being soft on communism. And in the context of the Soviet Union, it's also important to recognize that they themselves, after their split with China, are dealing with a lot of internal issues right now. This isn't the Soviet Union of the 50s and the 60s. This is a country that is now dealing with a lot of the internal contradictions inherent within its political system. And the amount of strength that they can show the world, whether it's in the UN or in military force or in foreign aid to their allies, is also decreasing. So it looks like the United States, for really the first time since the Cold War started, might be gaining somewhat of an upper hand. And everyone is giving Richard Nixon a lot of credit for that.
Exactly. All right. So I think that, for the purposes of the episode, it might make sense to very briefly just chat about sort of the Republican primary. I don't think, it's all that exciting or that much to cover, but worth briefly giving you the update there. Obviously, Nixon is going into 72, running for re-election. He's opposed by a few folks from the Republican Party, both from sort of the right and the left. But effectively, clobbers them throughout the nomination process. He wins landslide victories in almost every state. Nobody really comes close. But then, Shravan, do you want to talk a little bit about the VP selection?
Yeah, absolutely. So Nixon's VP pick in 1968 was this guy from Maryland, the governor of Maryland at the time, Spiro Agnew, who was maybe like the one person who everyone recognized as having a worse temperament than Richard Nixon. Very kind of cranky, loud, obnoxious, conservative guy. Ties to the John Birch Society. That kind of figure in the Republican Party, and he was picked by Nixon especially in order to kind of align himself with the more conservative wing. And everyone thought he was going to just go off cuff and say something crazy and cost them the election, but he didn't. So Nixon still kind of wants to get him off the ticket in 72. He wants to go with John Connally, who was the former governor of Texas, who you might best know for being in the car with JFK when JFK was shot in 1963. And Connally is Nixon's Secretary of Treasury at the time, I believe. And he is an ex-Democrat. Nixon figures, hey, by picking a guy like this, I basically have a unity ticket available for me. We'll win the election easily. And as we find out later, can't really do better than what he did, but Agnew stays on the ticket, appeases the conservative wing of the party. Nixon gets the nomination pretty much without a hitch, even though there are protests by the anti-war protesters, counterculture protesters, etc. at the convention. It's a pretty easy process for Nixon. He's thinking about the general the whole time. Now, there is this one thing that you probably have heard of. It's called Watergate. And we don't want to spend too much time into that. But basically, there's this thing called the Committee to Re-elect the President, which has
also known as CREEP, my favorite political acronym of all time.
Oh, absolutely the best. And Nixon is a very paranoid man by nature. So he's got all these people working around him who he calls the plumbers. And these guys are basically trying to protect him, get whatever information they can. The Watergate Hotel is where the Democratic Party is headquartered in the early 1970s. Nixon sends a bunch of people to break into that hotel to get some information. Obviously, that becomes a whole thing that's drawn out over the course of the second term. At the time, though, it's reported as a break-in, and no one really thinks much about it. There are a lot of other things that kind of go into it that isn't really based on any sort of electoral basis. But the one favorite fact that I always have about this is someone who's very closely associated with this, break-in and this effort to reelect Nixon was this guy, George Steinbrenner, who, as many of you know, is the former owner of my favorite baseball team, the New York Yankees. And he was someone who actually was convicted for his role in kind of electioneering as part of this process.
Yeah. So all in all, I think we want to spend the bulk of the time on this episode talking about the Democratic primary and really how that played out. What were the dynamics at play? Who were the main participants? And ultimately, how the Democratic Party changes or adjusts itself as a result of the primary. Um, I think one thing to just kind of lay out here is that there's really a sense of dread in the Democratic primary in a similar way as to actually what we saw in the 2020 primary about, putting somebody up against Nixon. The overwhelming urge of, the Democratic Party apparatchiks and probably the voters as well is, a need to get Nixon out of the White House, defeating Nixon sort of at all costs. So I think that's like an important piece to think about. I think the second thing that's also really important in the dynamics here is that if you'll recall, in '68, the eventual nominee of the Democratic Party, Hubert Humphrey, did not win a single primary in 1968. He came in kind of as the favorite of the party bosses, was nominated sort of over the heads of the activist base of the party, and went on to lose that election. As a result of that loss, actually, George McGovern leads up a reform committee or a reform commission sort of after that '68 election to rewrite the rules of the primary process and make it more democratic in hopes of avoiding basically a repeat of '68. And what that comes out to is basically, in large part, what we see in the primary process today, which is that state delegations to the party nomination are now based on proportionality or a winner takes all basis with vote share in the primaries. And basically, Democrats agree that the nominee should be based on the winners, whoever wins, the majority of delegates in the primary. So the other thing to keep in mind, basically, is that McGovern has a huge role in actually writing the rules for the primary season that's going to come up ahead. I think with that, it probably makes sense to start talking about the candidates themselves. A huge number, once again, of Democrats entered this election. Some of them are names that we've heard before. Hubert Humphrey, sort of the old labor, the old guard Democrat. We remember Gene McCarthy runs again. He was the anti-war candidate who came shockingly close in '68 to winning the nomination. But it was taken away from him at the convention. And this time, our good friend, George Wallace, decides not to run as part of the American Independent Party, but decides to actually run on the Democratic platform or the Democratic ballot line.
So borrow a term here from the Soviets. This is part of George Wallace's rehabilitation within the Democratic Party. He runs on this very kind of hard line anti-integration platform in 1968, but he's moderating at this time because he realizes that if he wants to be the Democratic governor in the state of Alabama, he's going to need the African-American vote. So he's pushing to the center, and not 72, but I think in 74, the next election, he ends up getting endorsed by the NAACP. We mentioned that earlier, but I still want you guys to understand that the man who famously said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever eventually got endorsement by the NAACP. And that's really it.
Probably one of the most stunning transformations in American political life. But yeah. And then in terms of new participants, let's say, or new game show contestants, maybe in the '72 election, I'll start off with the guy who was sort of considered to be the front runner for much of the election. I would compare him in many ways to the Jeb of 2016, Ed Muskie. Big Ed. Senator Muskie was the senator from Maine, the great state of Maine. And this was the guy who kind of took over the Humphrey role from '68 as sort of the standard bearer for the establishment of the Democratic Party. He was the guy who got all the big endorsements, even before the primary started. He had all the money from the, big party bosses, and he had the support of, frankly, the machines that still play a significant role in the Democratic Party's nomination process at this time. We'll go into more about how his campaign crashes and burns later, but at the get-go, sort of the nomination is up for his for the taking, let's say. Okay, and then kind of on the last few folks that we'll talk about, briefly, Scoop Jackson, a great nickname. His name's actually Henry Jackson, but he's a senator from, I believe, Oregon. And he is kind of on the right wing of the party. He agrees with Nixon on Vietnam, wants to make sure he's kind of one of the original neocons, quite frankly, as well, in how he believes American power should be used. abroad, but he's running kind of on the right of the party. And then, to round things out, you have Shirley Chisholm, who is a congresswoman, I believe, from New York, running more on the left. She is actually very significant for being the first female person of color to run for major political presidency of this country. So very significant in that way as well.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is important to understand about like Democrats like Scoop Jackson is Scoop Jackson is one of those candidates who, in our modern day and age, we associate him with kind of like a Bush era conservative. But that's because he represented the New Deal wing of the Democratic Party that allowed its kind of foreign policy bona fides to override their domestic bona fides, right? Like these are people who still believe in the welfare state, still believe in some form of like almost social democracy. They're proponents of civil rights. They're pretty close to Rockefeller Republicans in a lot of ways. They're just Democrats because of whatever kind of state political structures allowed them to rise to power. But this is an important contingent of the Democratic Party that eventually ends up leaving. And we'll talk more about that kind of later when we do our postmortem of the election. But Scoop Jackson is maybe not the most important political figure in history, but the people that he represents do end up being very influential in American foreign policy discourse.
Yep. And the one candidate we haven't talked about, who I think we can spend a good amount of time on, is George McGovern himself. George McGovern, just to give you a little bit of bio background, he is the son of a Methodist preacher from out in the prairie, South Dakota. He brilliant man, PhD in history from South Dakota State University. Flew bomber missions in World War II. Nerves of Steel, decorated sort of war hero as well. And viewed really, I believe the quote from Bobby Kennedy was the most fundamentally decent man in the U.S. Senate. Really viewed as
question.
Sorry? Yes.
Was he the original Pete Buttigieg?
I think. Well, let's see. Veteran. I don't know. I think Pete has a lot more dirty tricks up his sleeve. Let me put it that way.
He was a high school debater. He was an excellent high school debater.
That's true. There's some things there. Maybe there's something to that. I wonder if we can push on that a little bit further later on in the episode. Yeah, but also somebody deeply opposed to the war in Vietnam as well. And sort of a liberal paragon. And anti-communist, like most people still are in the Democratic Party, but more in favor of détente with the Soviet Union, less in favor of confrontation with the communist states, and most importantly, I would say, in the context of the Democratic primary, in favor of sort of immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam, which is a strong differentiating factor between him and many of the other candidates in the election. I don't know, Shravan, anything else you want to say about McGovern? I think he's one of those people who fundamentally gets a bad rap in American politics, but maybe in part because he is probably also one of the most decent people to run for office in this country.
I mean, the thing I'll say about McGovern is like we'll get into the comparisons that I think he and Bernie Sanders have later on in the episode. The one thing that I think is extremely important to understand is like he's a party man through and through. Like he calls himself a Democrat. He works for the DNC. He like rubs shoulders with the bosses. He's not trying to kind of upend the party from within. He really sees himself as a Democrat and as someone who is kind of the true successor to like the New Deal wing of the party. He's not someone who's trying to change the Democratic Party. He sees the party as good, and he sees it himself as the natural heir apparent. And that I think is something that's very different than how a lot of people characterize him today. He's insurgent in his ideology, no question, but that's not necessarily how he sees himself.
Yeah, and I think one of the books that I'm leaning on heavily to help inform this conversation, which I'd highly recommend everyone read, is Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail of 72 by Hunter S. Thompson, a really, really incredible journalist. but he has a quote where he says, "And there is the flaw in McGovern. When the whistle blows, he's still a party man," which I think really well sums that up. Yeah. And so as we get into the nomination itself, or into the primary process itself, the one sort of voice who didn't end up running but cast kind of a shadow over this whole situation is, for sort of the fourth election in the row, another Kennedy. In this case, Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy, the youngest son, more or less, decides not to run in 72. But in many, I think the consensus at the time was if he ran, he had a good shot of winning the thing. But that's just another tidbit for another maybe historical what if. What if Kennedy had decided to run at this point?
By the way, this is literally the first presidential election after he drove off a bridge with a woman and ended up kind of like, yeah, probably murdered her. Like let's be honest, we're all adults here. Like probably murdered her. And yeah, like he's the front runner for the Democratic Party primary. And the parallel we see today in Massachusetts is Ed Markey, who's like a very good, like liberal incumbent senator, representative of Massachusetts in a lot of ways, is getting primaried by this fucking shit fuck known as Joe Kennedy the Third. And
if your name is the third, you should be thrown in jail, like, or constitution at very minimum constitutionally barred for running from office. Like, come on.
Look, and you guys might be thinking that we're harsh, but understand that our families come from India, where we have to deal with this thing called the Nehru Gandhi dynasty, which has stifled left politics in the country for the better part of 40 years. So, like, believe me when we say family dynasties are not good for politics. But the practical takeaway in 72 is that, anyone with the last name Kennedy is just still going to be this very influential figure in American public life. And it may just be Massachusetts today, but in 1972, it was still the whole country.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so let's go into the primary a bit, the Democratic primary. So things kick off with the Democratic primary in the great state of New Hampshire, where I think like these are the elections where a lot of the boomer reporters who currently control kind of the media right now, or not control, but like are strongly overrepresented in the media right now, kind of got all of their priors. And I think like, we've covered a couple of elections now, and New Hampshire actually plays a significant role in both of these, which is in part why it has such an outsized importance today, in today's political nomination process. But in New Hampshire, Ed Muskie goes in as sort of the odds-on favorite. He's from the next door state of Maine. He is polling, 20, 30 points ahead of the other candidates, and is really seen as kind of the odds-on favorite to win a thumping victory in New Hampshire, and then basically run the table from here on out. But sort of in the background, there's this insurgent candidate who's polling at 5% nationally, give or take, known as George McGovern. And he is coming up pretty sharply, actually, in New Hampshire, on the back of, I think, what was really the first, let's say, grassroots organizational effort in a Democratic primary system, which is to say that because he wrote the rules of the 72 primary election, he had a sense for what it took to win. And I think what McGovern's brilliance was, and it informs kind of campaigns, as far in the future, was he really hit the ground running with a field organization that was independent of Democratic machines in the various areas in which they were running. So instead of going to the local union boss or to the mayor of the town or whatever, who would be able to deliver 300, 400, 500 votes, he had an army of volunteers on the ground actually doing the work of identifying likelies, identifying unlikelies, and then really pioneering what we do now in politics, which is actually then dedicating your resources towards turning out your likelies or persuading undecideds. And this is something that's really unique. There's a lot of really good context about this in Fear and Loathing as well. And it gets picked up and used kind of in all nominations thereafter. But on the back of this incredibly strong organization that's kind of being built out of nothing in New Hampshire, McGovern pulls off a surprise victory against the forces of, let's say, the Democratic establishment, which shocks everyone a little bit. and gives him some strong momentum going into the rest of the process.
Yeah, and I guess Krishna, do we want to talk about the Canuck letter for a second?
Yeah, one of the stupidest political scandals in American history. But yes, let's talk about it.
So I guess the Canuck letter was basically this letter that Muskie was alleged to have wrote, where it where basically someone had claimed that he had made disparaging remarks about French Canadians, which is like in of itself. This
Wait,
is
the context is even better though. The context was somebody asked him, "How do you plan to, be the Democratic nominee when you don't understand African American voters, given that the state of Maine has basically 0% African American population back in '72?" And the claim he was said to have made was, "Yeah, we don't have black people, but we have Canadians." Absolutely. And I think the real issue that Muskie had coming out of New Hampshire, and we'll go on to the rest of the primary after this, is that his whole persona and the reason he was getting all these endorsements, all this money, was because he built his entire candidacy not ideologically. He kind of fell in the nebulous center of the party, but because he was the only one who could beat Nixon. In a lot of ways, he was setting himself up to similar to how Joe Biden ran his campaign in 2020, or has run his campaign in 2020 as the reason you should vote for me is because I can beat Nixon. And I think losing in New Hampshire, a state where he was heavily favored to win, really punctured that image of him. And a lot of his potential voters went running because they didn't believe in Muskie. They believed in his ability to beat Nixon. So that's the other thing to consider here. Then the nomination process brings its way down into Florida, where George Wallace wins every single county in the state of Florida. And I think people recognize that George Wallace was going to win in Florida, given that he had won it, I believe in '68 as an independent candidate. And Florida is the kind of state that goes for, somebody like Wallace. But I think the sheer scale of his victory was deeply surprising to folks, and probably surprising in some ways to the Wallace campaign itself. So everyone else kind of, flails out in Florida. Bulk of the votes go to Wallace there.
And one thing I think to note about Florida at the time, this is, as you can tell, one of my favorite topics is examining state demographics and kind of how people interact with each other in like an electoral process. But Florida at this time still isn't like this super diverse capital of like kind of the Spanish speaking world that it does become today. It's still fairly rural. Like development in Florida has really been only around for 40, 50 years. And I don't want to Florida explain in front of Krishnan, who's actually from Florida. But it's certainly important to note the demographics of the state are definitely more reflective of a wider, more conservative state than maybe we see it today.
Yeah, Florida was still a fundamentally southern state, I think, at this point, which is important to note.
Yeah. All right. So so Wallace wins the Florida primary. I think the thing that we end up kind of getting into is he ends up getting, shot in an assassination attempt. And that was in mid-May. So actually I think it was like yesterday, 48 years ago or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
But
it's kind of crazy.
That does end his campaign. And he ends up pulling out in July ahead of the convention.
Yes, exactly. I think the couple other primary races I want to cover though before we get to the convention itself are Wisconsin and I think California, because I think these are the two races that ultimately, there's some interesting dynamics basically at play in each of these races that like play themselves out in the general election or don't, and I think it really deeply informs like how the general election goes. So just to give you a heads up here, in Wisconsin, which is basically was favored once Muskie had kind of lost a lot of momentum coming out of New Hampshire and then being beaten badly in Florida. Wisconsin was really kind of seen as Ed Muskie's last stand, but it was complicated by the fact that you also had Hubert Humphrey running at this point, who was from Minnesota and played a lot and also had a lot of support in Wisconsin. But the thing I want to call out about Wisconsin is, once again, McGovern's ground game actually wins him a surprise victory in Wisconsin. And the thing I want to note here is that he wins across all segments of the population. He wins, I have a quote here, Uh, in Green Bay's Ward 12, which is mostly made up of paper mill workers at the time, he beat Wallace 32-22. In Sheboygan's Ward 4, another blue collar factory worker neighborhood, he got 40% against Humphrey's 26 and Wallace's 9%. And in a township, with Lutheran dairy farmers, he wins 52-14%. Uh, and I think the other thing to note here is there's a lot of voters in Wisconsin who are Wallace McGovern voters, in that they have one of those two candidates as their top choice. And it's kind of fascinating because these are two almost what we would think as diametrically opposed politicians. One is a racist governor from the South, other a Methodist minister from South Dakota. But in both ways, they represent outsider, quote, I'm putting it in air quotes, but outsider perspectives on the Democratic Party, and there's a lot of support for those voters. So there's a common myth, I think, which is that the hard hat voters desert the Democratic Party and McGovern loses because of that. And that, I mean, to be fair, that has some truth in it, but it certainly wasn't true in the primary, where McGovern actually did quite well with the union blue collar vote. So that's piece one, and the victory in Wisconsin, I think, gives McGovern a lot of momentum and a lot of kind of money comes into him from small donors. He kind of starts the whole small donor trend by literally getting checks mailed to him from random people. And then ultimately, Ed Muskie drops out of the race and the whole thing shifts to California. California is sort of the last big nominating state before the convention. It's a winner take all state. And actually, George McGovern is kind of in the driver's seat here. He's doing really well. He has a 10-point, 15-point lead in the polls. But then the lead up to the election, Hubert Humphrey, who has at this point taken on sort of the standard bearer of the moderate wing, goes savagely on the attack against McGovern. This is where the phrase acid, amnesty, and abortion gets popularized as sort of the thing that gets tied to McGovern. And what happens is these brutal attacks from the centrists in the Democratic Party, cut down on McGovern's lead from 15 points in the polls to ultimately, I think he wins by about 5 points. He still wins, and he wins all of the delegates from the California primary, but this is a sense, of where the attacks against him are heading, and right now they're being spearheaded by Democrats within the party itself.
Yeah. No, I agree with everything there. I think the one additional thing we can add is kind of when you look at these Wallace McGovern voters, what you can tell, and that's something that I think a lot of people missed out, including people like me in the 2020 primary, is American voters are not inherently ideological with the way they pick their candidates. There are a lot of factors that go into play. And yes, there is that outsider element, but there are also a variety of different ways that Americans can see their candidates. And what I think 72 has in common with 2020 when we look at the primaries is that you just have a lot of different options. You have a couple serious options, but you have a lot of different options as to who could potentially be the standard bearer for the party. And even those people who are running on kind of smaller platforms and a smaller scale are still offering, I think, valuable input as to some of the needs of the Democratic Party at the time. So Humphrey ends up eventually losing. He doesn't get the nomination, and McGovern does. But the attacks that Humphrey had sent on McGovern do end up impacting how McGovern has to deal in the general election, how he has to kind of recapture the voters who were alienated by Humphrey, right? The whole vote blue no matter who type of concept isn't really a thing in American politics here. And people are, they may be registered Democrats. They might still vote for the Republican if they don't like the candidate. And that's something that's important to consider here.
Absolutely. Great. So, I mean, basically, the long story short of the Democratic primary process is McGovern, kind of based on the strength of his grassroots campaign organization, which is sort of unique to American politics at this time, is really able to win a stunning number of victories in the primary process and comes in to the Democratic convention in Miami with enough delegates theoretically to win on the first ballot. I think that we should spend a little bit of time talking about the Democratic Convention because I think it kind of illustrates the splits in the Democratic Party that are going to play a huge role in both this election and elections to come. Just because, you know, in the 72 convention, a movement is basically headed up by Big Labor. I don't know if you guys have heard of George Meany, but this guy was the boss, more or less, of the AFL-CIO. And when you think about labor unions, I think we have a sense of the let's say castrated version of labor unions that we have today in this country. Really just focused on keeping their own membership rolls, unwilling to take risks in organizing for fear of losing, and really, the government and corporations kind of have them by the balls. But in 72, big labor was still big labor. It still had a huge amount of influence on this process, and it was deeply conservative. And so the AFL-CIO, led by George Meany, were spearheading basically a Stop McGovern campaign, or an anyone but McGovern campaign at the nomination, where they got one Jimmy Carter, governor of Georgia, to basically lead up that process. So these guys were throwing a bunch of dirty tricks at the board to try and get, for example, California had been a winner-take-all state. They tried to argue that actually Hubert Humphrey should get half the delegates from California because he only lost by 5 points, even though everyone knew it was winner-take-all. They were trying every sort of parliamentary trick in the book to deny McGovern the nomination, but they end up failing. And realistically, in the primary and in the convention, this is the first convention where kind of the grassroots activists take charge of the convention versus the traditional interest groups of the Democratic Party, the labor unions and the big city machines.
Absolutely. And one of the things going into the convention that at the time, I think it was the House Majority Leader, eventually became Speaker of the House, and was a household political figure at the time, was Tip O'Neill. And Tip O'Neill talks about in his autobiography, Man of the House, basically going into the convention, there's this kind of sense of dread among establishment Democrats, even ones who like support progressive causes. Not necessarily because they disagree with the outcome of the policy proposals that McGovern is supporting, but in large part due to the fact that the insurgents of McGovern would basically mean that politicians like them, who had built their foothold in the party through the inside establishment route, would not necessarily have the same power or prestige that they would later on. So O'Neill goes into this convention with basically thinking the general is going to be a lost cause. Let's focus on winning the Senate. Let's focus on winning the House. And he kind of rallies around the other Democratic political figures at the time on a national level, Speaker of the House Carl Albert, like Richard Daley, etc. Chats with them and basically says, all right, like we're going to have to focus our resources on maintaining our majority in Congress. And that's a key factor of the 1972 election, right? Like there's like open sabotage, and then there's just not playing your hardest in the election. And this is really a case where, yeah, there were some dirty tricks leveled at the book, but when the Democratic Party already decides that, the general election is a lost cause, let's focus on the House and the Senate, that makes the rest of the electoral process much, much trickier.
Yeah. And I think there's a phrase called the sort of iron law of institutions, which is that leaders, or let's say power holders within an institution, are ultimately more care more about holding power within that institution than the victory of the institution itself. And so what that means in the context of this election is that people like Daley, Meany, George Meany, and even people like Ted Kennedy felt like it made more sense to throw the election to Nixon, in the hopes and understanding, frankly, that if McGovern lost to Nixon and lost big, they would be able to then reassert their own power within the Democratic Party and effectively, quash this rebellion and take control of the party once again.
And I think what's important to note here, and our political point of view is very clear and from the left, but this is like open information. This is like well documented facts that the Democratic Party establishment at the time was just willing to let McGovern lose. And there are a lot of justifications that can be thrown on there. For example, like, oh, like they're going to alienate working class voters who are culturally conservative, blah blah blah. I'm sure you've never heard that before, but this is the this is like well documented. People knew that this was happening at the time. People knew that this was how a lot of the party leaders felt, and people who would normally go and canvass and whip votes basically said, not they didn't tell their voters to vote for Nixon, but they said, hey, do what you got to do.
Yeah.
Vote your conscience. And whenever anyone says vote your conscience, that's basically them telling you we don't give a shit.
Yeah. And I mean, this is not to take away from, I think, missteps and mistakes that the McGovern campaign made. I think we can go into those as well. But fundamentally, the quote unquote, let's say, hardcore base of the Democratic Party for the last, 20 years, the labor unions and sort of the city machines, they did not feel a vested interest in having to win this election, and ultimately enabled a huge fraction of the Democratic base to go to Nixon, or frankly to sit out the election. But I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the major mistakes, I think, of the McGovern campaign, and how it ultimately, set them off on a totally wrong foot. So I think in today's election processes, people have this vision of, the candidate sews up the nomination, takes some time to pick a VP candidate, and then you go into the nomination process. You go into the convention, and it's just by acclamation, effectively,
the coronation.
right? The coronation, correct. But in this case, because it was still kind of unclear who was going to win, even going into the nomination, even though McGovern had the most votes, the McGovern campaign actually did not spend a lot of time thinking through who their vice presidential candidate was going to be. They had initially thought Ted Kennedy might have been interested in taking the job. And quite frankly, I think a McGovern-Kennedy ticket could have done quite well, maybe even beating Nixon. But Kennedy was not interested. He wanted the top job and was willing to wait and see McGovern, go away in order to get there. But the main consideration that I think the McGovern campaign had in picking a VP was effectively being able to reach back out to the Daley, Meany, Humphrey wing of the party and be conciliatory and say, hey, we're willing to bring on one of your own as our VP candidate in exchange for support going forward. And so as they go into that, they nominate a guy named Senator Thomas Eagleton from the great state of Missouri, who is viewed as sort of this, has his roots in big labor, is viewed as kind of in the moderate wing of the party, and is seen as somebody who, would be a conciliatory figure, effectively. Now, what the McGovern campaign didn't know were two things. One, Thomas Eagleton was actually the guy who came up with the phrase acid amnesty and abortion during the course of the nomination process. Reporters, this was an open secret amongst the press corps, and if the press corps had told the McGovern campaign about it, or if they learned about it, probably strong likelihood he would not have gotten nominated. The other thing they didn't know about Eagleton was that I believe it was like 10, 15 years prior to this nomination, he had undergone electroshock therapy for mental health issues, depression, suicidal ideation, those sort of things. And because the process was so rushed from, choosing Eagleton to his actual, nomination as vice president, nobody vetted this and nobody realized that this could be an issue in his background. And Eagleton himself actually lied about it when asked directly by the McGovern campaign if there were any potential issues that could hurt. And so this was a huge misstep, effectively, in the campaign. And when ultimately news that Eagleton had gone through these treatments, leaked out to the press and then became a massive issue, the McGovern campaign ultimately backtracked after saying that they would support Eagleton and had him replaced on the ticket with Sergeant Shriver, who is, no need to go deeply into him, but basically a Catholic.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, or ex-law of Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. And also a Kennedy, I think, somehow by marriage, right? Like, very weird how
Shriver, who probably was the best Kennedy in terms of like her actual life's work, because she helped special needs kids and helped the Special Olympics. So like, she might be the only Kennedy who's actually a good person. So that's important.
Yeah. But somehow these Kennedys always pop up out of the woods. But yeah, and I think like one thing that Hunter S. Thompson brings up, which I actually very much agree with, is so much of McGovern's appeal was as this sort of fresh candidate, this frank candidate who was not, in the mold of the average politician. But his backtracking on Eagleton, first saying he would stand with him and then seemingly abandoning him, after the reports came out, I think really put a dent in McGovern's image as this candidate. And there was polling at the time that basically showed that he lost a solid 13% of supporters, to Nixon almost directly as a result of the Eagleton issue shortly after the nomination.
Yeah, those are all really important factors. And if you think about the presidency in as an administrative role as opposed to just an ideological role, if you can't pick a proper vice president, if you can't vet them properly, like how are you going to be able to vet all the other positions that are so important as part of governing on a daily basis? Like the vice president really doesn't actually do anything. Like, what about your Secretary of State? What about your, Chief Justices, etc.? I think maybe it's time we gear into the general election strategy a little bit for the Nixon administration and how they approached what was a pretty winnable election for them. He's a popular incumbent president. The economy's doing okay. He's got a lot of victories and like pieces of legislation that he could point to. Certainly more than really any other first-term president in American history, like since. And Nixon's got a lot going for him at this point. So you guys have all heard of the Southern strategy, and I'll let Krishnan touch upon that because that's super important. But there's also a Northern strategy going on, which is basically kind of the transition of white ethnic groups in the Democratic Party in the North who may have association with labor, but now are increasingly middle class and switching parties and voting for Nixon. And, as Krishnan talked about in the last episode, these guys are like the forerunners of the car dealership owners who end up voting for Trump. So I'm from the North, Krishnan's from the South. Chris, you want to start us off with the Southern strategy?
Yeah, yeah, and I think people generally know about this, but this was obviously Nixon and kind of pioneered it in '68. But it was the idea of peeling off, sort of disaffected Democrats in the South, people who were flocking to sort of the southern suburbs, which were springing up around major cities in the South, like Atlanta, for example. People who were kind of, frankly, pissed off about the Civil Rights Act, which obviously, moved towards bringing racial equality to the South, pissed off by the civil rights movement, and sort of viewed the social fabric of the country as slipping away from them. And Nixon ran a campaign, a dog whistle campaign on law and order, in an attempt to peel those people out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party. Now, in '68, it kind of worked, but it didn't work as well because, in large part, because Wallace was also running, and he was frankly a much more authentic candidate for that sort of racial grievance than Nixon could be. But in '72, Wallace, who suffered the assassination attempt, is no longer running. There's no, frankly, third party American Independent Party worth speaking about in this election. And this is the election where kind of that Southern strategy pays full dividends, as white Democrats in the South basically leave the party in huge numbers and move into the Republican Party. And I think, spoiler alert, Nixon wins 48 states, but this is the first election where Republicans win effectively every state in the Confederacy, in the old Confederacy.
And this isn't a permanent thing. When you look at the 1976 election, the map almost switches directly back to blue with Jimmy Carter, who is kind of like the definitive Southern Democratic politician at the time. But one thing to note, kind of in the context of American politics here, is you see that the South is becoming not only more populous, but wealthier over the course of the 60s and the early 70s. Before you really had this distinction between a wealthy Southern kind of upper crust, upper class, and a largely, working class, working poor African American and white population, largely divided because of racial issues, but generally speaking, neither of them are very well off. Now you see kind of the emergence of a Southern middle class in a very unique manner in these suburbs that kind of Krishna touched upon earlier. As part of white flight, you have people moving in from the North who are escaping in part due to influx of so-called urban types into their neighborhoods in New York City and Boston. and Philadelphia, etc. So you definitely see this remaking of the South. This isn't the same South that was voting for Strom Thurmond in 1948. It is demographically and culturally becoming a little bit different, shaped by their views on civil rights and their dissatisfaction with the New Deal like elements of the Democratic Party. And kind of touching upon that, I guess, I integrated that into my spiel on the South. But in the North, you see the fleeing of white ethnic groups, particularly Irish Americans and Italian Americans, from the Democratic Party. And I grew up around these types of people, so these are my neighbors, these are my friends, my teachers, and you see a lot of people who have roots in New York or Philadelphia or Boston, tend to be Catholic, is a defining trait. Nixon does very well with Catholics in the election. But many of them are frustrated by urban decay. Many of them have had historical grievances with the influx of minority groups into their neighborhoods in New York. A lot of them moved to Staten Island. A lot of them moved to New Jersey.
Busing is like, this is where busing becomes a massive political issue in the 70s that we can't really even imagine today.
Right. And one unique thing about the McGovern platform is this is really the most liberal platform in American history. Like
TM, trademark.
Like this really is it. Like it fully endorses busing, which was a very controversial stance to take at the time.
Yeah, just to say, it supports the Equal Rights Amendment. It supports it has Yang bucks. It has a guaranteed $1,000 a year, I believe, for families, and a jobs guarantee, ending Vietnam immediately, defense cuts in the realm of somewhere between 30 to 50%. It really is the most liberal platform ever.
Yeah. And the reason why we're bringing this up is because for me personally, one of my political pet peeves is whenever people talk about demographic shifts in the context of American politics. Like, if you think just because this country becomes more Latino, the Democrats will win every election, I'm sorry, that's just not how it works. If we had said that in the 1950s, we would have said, yeah, as more Irish and Italian immigrants come into this country, the Democrats will never lose another election. Political demographic shifts don't really make sense because of the fact that as you have more of an ethnic group come into the United States, that ethnic group becomes wealthier. It has more people who represent part of the so-called kind of insider class within politics. And as a result, they will become more conservative, if solely on economic issues. And a lot of the groups that we're talking about today, particularly African Americans in the South and Mexican American immigrants, are culturally conservative, just as Irish Americans and Italian Americans at this time were, relative to, say, their white, waspy Northern Protestant neighbors. So just something to consider here. So I would encourage all of you to definitely think about how these white ethnic groups have changed their party allegiance, almost done a 180 over time, and how it's not impossible that other groups would as well, especially when you consider that Donald Trump is pretty much predicted to have the best numbers among Latinos since George H.W. Bush, the best numbers among African Americans since Gerald Ford. So this is not something that we're going to be able to ignore. Minority groups can still become more conservative over time, depending on how they see their relative status in American life changing.
Yep. So I think then, kind of, as you think about the general, frankly, it's probably one of the most depressing and least suspenseful general elections of all time. Coming out of, the Democratic nomination, Nixon is leading in the polls 60-30, something like that, versus McGovern. And frankly, that gap never really narrows throughout the entire course of the election. And there are these two sort of, trends that are squeezing McGovern as we go through the election. The first is the defection, like Shravan said, of white ethnics and blue-collar workers and big labor from the Democratic Party. These people are either literally switching to Nixon or they're sitting out the election. Then the second, and this was supposed to be what helped McGovern overcome any defections there, was this, vaunted youth vote that was supposed to come out strongly for McGovern and sort of carry him to the nomination and to the presidency. And what happens there, and I think this is where Thompson has a really good point of view that I'd love to discuss, is he basically says that if you're going to run like McGovern did as a candidate against the Democratic establishment, what you can't do is after you win the nomination, go and endorse literally every single member of the Democratic establishment, which is what McGovern went ahead and did. He went to Chicago and endorsed Daley. And I think there's a story. He actually endorsed a candidate for Attorney General of Illinois who was part of the squad that broke into Fred Hampton's apartment and killed him. And so you see this sort of, there's this idea of McGovern as like the decent man, the good man, someone who's going to shake things up. But because at the end of the day, he is a Democratic Party, person and a Democratic Party politician, and yes, he wants to remake the party, but he's still a party man. He is obligated to go and support the old school Democrats who he's just defeated, and that turns off a lot of the youth base that may have gone for him, and it turns off a solid amount of the Wallace base that could have gone in favor of him as well. So he has these two trends that are sort of squeezing him, and ultimately they lead to one of the biggest landslide defeats in American political history.
Yeah. I guess to kind of wrap this up, where a big talking point among a lot of the baby boomer journalists who, as Krishnan said, got their reps in the 1972 election was that Bernie Sanders was the George McGovern of 2020. He could win the primary based off exciting the base and then would get absolutely clobbered in the general election. Now, obviously, neither of us would have felt that way, still feel that way. But what do you think, Krishnan, are the fair comparisons here between them? And what do you think are some of the key differences?
Yeah. Well, I think one key, all right, I'll start with the key differences because I also think that it's more important to bend sort of the stick away from trying to tie these two people together than to say that they're one and the same. Because I think you're totally right. The political instinct is to tie them together. I think the big difference I would say is just the popularity of Donald Trump versus Richard Nixon. Like Nixon was presiding over a booming economy, had over 60-70% political 60-70% approval ratings, was sort of seen as somebody who was palatable to wide swaths of America, etc. Donald Trump was not seen in those ways, and it would have been a totally different sort of candidate to run against. So I think that's part one. I think part two is kind of what you've hinted at, Shravan, which is McGovern was ultimately running, on reshaping the Democratic Party, but he was at the end of the day always a Democrat, whereas Bernie Sanders came from an independent tradition. He was not a Democrat, did not, identify as a Democrat, but caucused with them in Congress. And I think ran sort of outside of the Democratic Party, establishment, let's say. But I think where things actually do get closer is I think that Bernie Sanders, for all his history as an independent politician, sort of at some point between 2016 to 2020 came to really identify with the Democratic Party, even if he wasn't formally a part of it, and was doing kind of many of the same things that McGovern did, which is to say, boosting his ideological opponents in the party and granting them rhetorical and concessions where effectively, he may not have needed to do that. The example that comes to mind here is, both McGovern and Bernie Sanders both said that they would support their Democratic opponents against Nixon because they thought that they could win against Nixon. And I think those are the types of comparisons that are actually fair, which is that they were both ran as outsiders, but ultimately still were insiders to some extent.
Yeah, no, I would fully agree with that. And McGovern's failure in the 1972 election has, I think, one parallel with a lot of left-wing political movements that we've kind of seen try and fail in this country over the last 40, 50 years. And that's the difference between the New Deal coalition and literally every other attempt at radical left-wing policies. And I don't mean radicalism like socialism, but radicalism like social democracy, is that the New Deal coalition was able to bring in working class whites as a key element of that coalition. And one of the unique things about the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016 was that they were able to bring in working class white voters that Hillary had won over Obama in 2008, and they brought them into the fold as part of the Sanders coalition against Hillary Clinton in 2016. And in 2020, that really tailed off. That group broke by and large for Joe Biden, and that's why I think Sanders' performances were largely underwhelming in certain states. He didn't lose those voters to Elizabeth Warren. He lost those voters to Joe Biden. And for whatever those reasons are, I guess that is probably the story for a completely different episode. But I genuinely am very uncertain in any left wing coalition that claims to be able to bring out progressive change and or win elections without being able to have working class white voters as a centerpiece of that coalition.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think the McGovern campaign is like the first real example of. And the Democratic Party, no matter what happens, time and time again, elections where working class voters buy into the Democratic Party, whether or not they're running as a progressive, Democrats tend to win those elections. The elections where they don't, Democrats tend to lose those elections. And that's something that will surely be a theme of future episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the last piece I would talk about here is just like, and I think I'm coming around to the idea more and more fundamentally that this is like the significant issue with left wing politics in this country is there's just a credibility gap. You know, there's a gap between what you say as a left wing politician is possible versus what people have actually seen with their own eyes that's possible. And I think like where this comes into play is that it's actually quite difficult, or it has been quite difficult, for a left wing politician to find almost a, except in times of like severe political or economic crisis, let's say, let's set aside those times. But it's been difficult for them to find kind of a ready made majority coalition and then be able to use that to win and then ultimately go and implement policy. I think like what is potentially one of the better opportunities for the left wing, if it's even feasible, is somehow piecing together a plurality coalition and then using that plurality coalition to bring in the majority on board by implementing policy that ultimately benefits, a universal segment of the population. And I think like the reason I bring this up is just because I think like it's nearly impossible for real people to believe in significant political change because they've never seen it happen during their lifetimes. And I don't know if that is a feasible path forward for left wing Democratic politicians in the long run, is to just keep massive promises that clearly workers and voters don't believe that it can actually be kept.
I fully agree with everything you said. The one thing I would say about that is I think they've seen massive political change rightward. I don't think they've ever really seen it go left.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, one of the big challenges. I think that's
right.
all I have to say for today. Christian, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing I'll say here is sort of the aftermath of the election after, 72 happens and McGovern gets wiped out everywhere except for Massachusetts and DC. Just to give some stats to folks on that, 30% of Democrats go to Nixon. The youth vote, the vaunted youth vote, which is supposed to, go in a landslide to McGovern, ends up going about 52-46 to McGovern. The labor vote splits evenly. Nixon gets 20% of African Americans. And sort of in postmortems, McGovern basically is quoted as saying, "I opened the doors of the Democratic Party and 20 million people walked out." So really kind of a catastrophic loss. And then what happens kind of shortly afterwards is people who supported McGovern, the McGovernites, let's say, get totally purged out of all positions in the Democratic Party. The party is taken over once again by sort of the old guard. And basically the McGovernites never get another sniff at power. Frankly, probably until maybe Jesse Jackson, maybe even you could argue Bernie Sanders, but they're shunted out effectively into the wilderness for the next 30 years.
But what does George McGovern end up doing with his life? Because this isn't the end all be all for him. He's a pretty young man, relatively speaking. He's like 50 when he loses this election.
Yeah, I mean, he still is a Democratic senator. He goes right back to the Senate, and I think he still basically is like a progressive icon. And like you said, Shravan, he was super, super involved in the Food for Peace program, prior to running for president. And after running for president, he really became, really fundamentally involved in the idea of feeding the poor, educating the poor. And I think he even won an award, I want to say, in the 2000s or something like that. Like he won some award for basically his work on working for peace and working for feeding people. So once again, just more evidence that, hey, this is like an actually a fundamentally decent person. Um, but I think he was really diminished and really hurt by the fact that a fundamentally decent person could not win the 1972 election.
All right. Well, I think that's all that we have for you here today. Thank you guys so much for listening. And hopefully next time we'll be able to feature a guest.
Yes, absolutely. Have a great week, everyone, and stay safe.